The Fantasy Animation Podcast takes its listeners on a journey through the colliding and sometimes competing worlds of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Each episode, we select an example of fantasy animation and consider the ways in which it functions to inspire and use our imaginations within the sphere of all things that are sculpted, composed, crafted and drawn. To help support the show, please subscribe via your podcast feed and give us a like and a quick review. It takes no more than a minute, but it really helps us to grow our audience. You can also find our archive of podcasts and our weekly blog at fantasy-animation.org. You'll find the latest reviews there, features, editorials, all written by academics, writers, historians and professional animators working within these overlapping media, mediums and genres. Failing all that, tell your friends, tell a friend about the show and the good work we do here. There's no substitution for good old-fashioned word of mouth, so thanks for downloading, and I really hope you enjoy the show.
Hi listeners, welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So we're doing Spider-Man No Way Home for this episode. So we're returning to Marvel. We are doing the most recent, at the time of recording, but who knows, the Spider-Man movies, I guess the third in a trilogy that sort of connect together, and I think that'll be part of the conversations that we have. So this is sort of the crossover extravaganza, let's say, the kind of Spider-Man, you get 3 for the price of 1, as well as a few villains from previous iterations of the character, and we can kind of talk about that in relation to franchises. So obviously lots to say about kind of narrative and style, and I think kind of the multiverse phenomenon that has gripped a number of kind of popular Hollywood cinema, Hollywood films over the last few years. Visual effects. So I think there's lots to say. Fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've got anything like completely related to fantasy scholarship today, but of course it's a film that I have quite an imaginative response to. I think it's having grown up with the various incarnations of Spider-Man, being quite key to a sort of one's own development as a film fan and an academic. I think it's hard not to think about some quite emotionally affecting experiences of seeing a lot of these kind of worlds and previous memories collide with the new and things like that. So there's lots of fun imaginative
things. Does it feed
about.
Into some of your superhero stuff on? Are you doing kind of Spider? I know you're.
Oh, we can talk about ethics if you want.
Yeah, I'm just interested.
We might get there. Yeah, Spider-Man's an interesting ethical conundrum, so we might talk about that.
Responsibility, etc. Great responsibility.
Great, indeed. There's a whole slogan.
There is. So, thankfully, it's not just us. Joining us is a very special guest, Dr. Nick Jones, who is Senior Lecturer in Film, Television and Digital Culture at the University of York, and whose research interests include digital effects, popular cinema, and interactive media. He's published 2 books on the topic. So the first one, Hollywood Action Films and Spatial Theory, from 2015 with Routledge, as well as Space's Mapped and Monstrous, Digital 3D and Visual Culture, for Columbia University Press a couple of years ago, 2020. He's also written a number of chapters and journal articles in these areas too, ranging from pieces on the Resident Evil films, the perpetual motion aesthetic of action cinema, and most recently an article about VFX breakdown videos that reveal kind of questions of labour, duration, and VFX magic. Handily for us, this VFX breakdown article also touches on recent Spider-Man cinema. So Nick, many thanks for joining us for the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me.
So we have had debates off air about which film we are doing and why, and which film should perhaps lead the discussion and why. But we felt it was a good kind of, or when we talked to you about coming on, a good starting point would be Spider-Man No Way Home. But we can, in true tentacular style, go off into the other kinds of
in the film, much like the film itself. If we want to relive some of the past memories, I think it's
exactly.
We do so.
So it's it's the most recent, as I said, of a trilogy, but it's also in conversation with another 2 iterations of the character. So the early 2000s, and then I guess sort of 20 13, 14, Andrew Garfield and stuff like this. So as a starter for 10, what is it about this particular film, given the research interests that you have and are having about popular cinema and VFX and stuff like that? Why No Way Home? Why is it a good one for us to chat about and chat about with you?
So, great question. Why did I choose it? I don't know. I was wondering that myself as I was making these notes this morning, thinking, well, I have a lot that I want to say about it, but nothing that forms a cohesive kind of mission statement. I haven't done research into No Way Home specifically. I mention it in something that we'll talk about later on, I'm sure, in the podcast that I will plug mercilessly.
Do it.
But also, kind of as you guys have said, the way it plugs into a whole bunch of other Spider-Man films, but also issues around kind of transmedia franchising today. So I was thinking about what's going to fit the brief of the podcast and nicely, in an ideal world, bridge fantasy and animation. And I thought No Way Home has some really interesting stuff around kind of the fantastical space of a franchise. What you can do in the fantasy space that is a contemporary transmedia franchise, which is to say you can empty all of your toy box onto the floor and have everything kind of interacting. And also there's all these issues around kind of VFX and animation, and those are things that, as you pointed out very kindly in the introduction, that I have talked about in a recently published article about the second Tom Holland Spider-Man film.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting one. This film in particular, because we're currently recording this at the BAFTA conference, and I've had a lot of conversations about kind of contemporary Hollywood, and we talked about superheroes, and we talked about Marvel, and obviously we're in the latest phase of Marvel, where perhaps some of the kudos or quality, or let's say the responses to some of Marvel films of the past are not quite being replicated in the most recent phase of films. And it seems as though, and it's interesting that the two Spider-Man films, this one and Far From Home, which are very directly linked in terms of the final scene of the previous film, and then we lead kind of straight into this new film, No Way Home. They are in conversation, but they're also released quite closely together, which is sort of unusual to have two films, Spider-Man films. I think No Way Home is late 2021, and then Far From Home 2019, I think, which is quite close together. Normally Marvel spreads out its characters, and unless, of course, there are these big Avengers type movies, but in terms of standalone movies, there's a bit of a gap between some of them.
The thing I would throw in there, as close as they are together, of course, sort of just to do the historical context, they felt very far apart in that there was 2020 in the middle of it, right?
Yes.
So we had the thorny issue of kind of going through lockdowns and things like that, and this was very much pitched as a sort of cinema is back.
Cinema is back. We're all back. The communal experience.
Yeah.
And we're reliving our childhoods with all these kind of nostalgic nods to earlier films and just that warm fuzzy feeling post-pandemic that No Way Home provided. We will get to this in more detail, I hope, but I'm astonished, and I think it's fascinating that No Way Home came out within a few days of The Matrix Resurrections. And I think these films are very, very similar, but also very different in the way that they treat kind of overlapping themes and ideas around nostalgia and the past and kind of all of that stuff. So, two different ways of kind of dealing with what ended up being a post-pandemic reality, and kind of how we move on, what the next step is for us.
The reason I mention that kind of proximity is that there are 6 movies between the first Spider-Man, so Spider-Man Homecoming in 2017, and then Spider-Man Far From Home in 2019. So that's even just 2 years, but there are 6 movies in between those two. Between Far From Home 2019 and No Way Home 2021, there are only 3. So it's sort of Spider-Man's come around again, and it seemed, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this about Spider-Man being sort of a Marvel character that is, or a popular. These films in particular tend to do quite well. They're kind of a safe pair of hands, let's say. I think that Marvel are reliant, and perhaps the 3 that came between the Spider-Man films, we've got Black Widow, which is a kind of a great film, but had the COVID kind of in terms of release, the impact of COVID on the release date. Then Shang-Chi, which is a very different film, and then Eternals, which didn't do very well, which I love really. It's too long, but I think it's great. Then you have Spider-Man: No Way Home as a kind of safe pair of hands again. So it feels like the film has to do a lot with the COVID landscape. It has to do a lot with the reception of the Marvel films. It's whether or not I don't know the answer to this, and Marvel will never tell me whether it was kind of pushed forward because of it should have come later. In fact, I think it was. It's supposed to be the other way around from Multiverse, Doctor Strange and Multiverse, which we've done previously, and it feels like they were swapped round. Probably they will tell us because of filming and kind of reshoots and things like that. But it feels like to go straight into Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness after Eternals feels a bit of a risk given the tone of Multiverse, whereas this feels a little bit more, let's get everyone back, and that's all kind of pleasurable, and that's where the spectacle lies.
To add something to that, maybe this is just reflecting my own perspective a bit too much here, but I think there's something about the Spider-Man within the Marvel Cinematic Universe that has a sort of weirdly almost fractal logic to it, in that you could watch this as the next Marvel movie, like you've just plotted, or you can watch it as the third Spider-Man movie, or you can watch it as the ninth Spider-Man. Well, no, eighth in a kind of Star Wars-esque three eras of Spider-Man.
Yeah. So there's sagas. There's the Maguire saga.
And I wonder if how much, and I'm always interested in this with Marvel on a kind of boring but also, hopefully more interesting level of like, how much are we supposed to watch of all of this? And the answer is
all of it.
Well, all of it, and yet they don't want
your money.
And yet they don't want to alienate people too much if you've only seen some of it. So like, there's a weird like thing they do about like, I don't know, like I find the television shows often the consequences of the television shows have a more impact upon the films. There seems to be you can just watch the films, you might miss 30 seconds of a knowing look or something that you might have to whisper to someone, but actually we still want you to be able to watch the films without watching the TV shows. This feels like a film that you could watch in a very different way depending on which baggage you're bringing to it, and it gives to that, or it rewards those levels of nostalgia or those kind of those vested interests in different ways. So
and that's why I think it's Spider-Man is a great figure for our contemporary transmedia MC universe kind of present, because he's a web slinger. He's all about navigating and creating webs, and what we see in a film like Spider-Man: No Way Home is this huge, as you've just alluded, this huge transmedia web. All these connections, all these, kind of quivering it over here connects to all these other things over there. But at the same time, it has to, of course, as a kind of piece of, as a commodity, it has to be open to as many consumers as possible, and therefore it can't completely rely on all of these connections. They have to function as kind of extra bonuses or things that enrich the text, even as it also kind of wants to just function as a fun, jolly romp on its own terms.
So, depending on whether we class it as one of 31 films, one of 3 films, or one of 8 films, presumably that changes the way one provides a plot synopsis, because it is charged with the baggage of 30 other films, or at that point 26 other films. I think it was number 27. Are you
going to attempt it, though?
No, I'm going to ask you to. In terms of the plot, the implications of that is you either read it as the ongoing story of Spider-Man / Tom Holland's negotiation of a life without Iron Man and his relationship to, and the fact he was kind of burned in the previous film because of his kind of grief and kind of couldn't see what was in front of him with regards to Mysterio, or it's him navigating a world post Infinity Saga, or he's navigating the fact that he's one of 3 Spider-Men, big screen Hollywood Spider. So I'm just, in terms of the kind of plot, is it worth doing a sort of, what does this film do? Where does it pick up? Because the final scene, if I remember, of Far From Home is Quentin Beck, so Mysterio, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, reveals to the world. Yeah, I also just remembered that also Tom Holland is also in one of the Venom movies. So actually, he's in another one.
Yes, actually, you're quite right. There's whole. We're not going to get, unless we really want to. There's that whole Sony having its own franchise as an ancillary franchise to fun stuff.
That's a big web.
Anyway, so what Chris is asking is, what's the plot?
Yeah,
what
happens?
Is the plot?
How does it pick up, or what's this film
Spider-Man
kind of about?
Gets into trouble. Spider-Man gets out of trouble.
Yeah.
That's the plot.
Yeah.
Everyone loves that plot.
Yeah.
So we pick up, people know his secret identity.
Yes.
He goes to Doctor Strange, of course, kind of coming in from the rest of the Marvel universe, to do a spell, which goes horribly wrong, because everyone's kind of an idiot in this film and in so many of these films, and they don't just think things through and do them properly. And that releases all of these villains from other parts of the multiverse. And of course, as we all knew from the first trailer, especially those of us who are invested in Spider-Man or kind of media, mainstream media culture generally, these are villains from previous franchise iterations that we've been talking about. So the idea that the multiverse isn't just... The multiverse is a concept within the MCU which is about kind of different possibilities and possibility spaces, but it's also a way of just smearing and smudging together all of this different kind of IP that is now under one roof. So rather than these media products being distinct or maybe having occasional Easter eggs, you can literally have Doc Ock and Willem Dafoe show up from films that were made 25 years ago, 20 years ago, in a way that it's sort of, there's something still seemingly quite bold and brazen about that to me. Like this idea that we want to see these things as distinct media products, but then the narrative is saying, no, this is part of a rebooted transmedia franchise character, and the narrative relies on that. And I find that a weird kind of bit of intertextual, industrial openness.
Are the Marvel... And given that the Spider-Man films occupy a unique role then within the MCU, if we're saying that, are they unique in that sense? Because as you were talking, I was thinking about the 2019 Elizabeth Banks Charlotte's Angels and how they have to negotiate the fact that it's a reboot, but it's not quite a reboot because there are scenes where the characters go into a big sort of costume room where all the costumes from the previous movies and images and stuff, and it's like, so that did happen, and we're not trying to negate that happened. Rather the opposite, we're really embracing it and pulling it in. So it seems like that's a way to do these kinds of stories, to that smudging and blurring, and actually saying, no, it's part of they used to be distinct, but they kind of never were, because look how close they are. The proximity between us is so close.
And I think the multiverse concept is a wonderful, as far as kind of Hollywood is concerned, it's a wonderful alibi for doing all of this. So kind of mainstreamed with Rick and Morty, but now we've got it in the MCU. We're going to see it in the Flash movie. I don't know when that comes out in terms of when this podcast is released, but Michael Keaton's old Batman showing up alongside Ben Affleck's Batman in this Flash spin-off from Justice League or whatever. So and all because we have the multiverse. So the multiverse allows these companies to redeploy intellectual property and kind of known actors, and to give us that kind of sting of nostalgic excitement through the excuse that, this person's stepping in from another universe, with universe kind of being a stand-in word for franchise. And so everything turns into the Lego movie, essentially.
Yeah. Isn't there I think Dan Golding, who's written about legacy cinema and legacy franchises, and you have that sort of handover, and I think we talked about this before, the sort of, when we've done the Star Wars movies, Hamill handing, the baton is being passed. Yeah. So those sorts of mechanisms have, I guess, existed, but this feels a lot more intensified because it's not about passing things along as much as, because that implies a sort of passing down, whereas here it's passing horizontally because it's all on the same sort of plane, or it's all sort of, the illusion is the assumption is that all these worlds exist simultaneously, and we've talked kind of about the temporality of multiverses, that they're not before and after, they are literally happening at the same time, and that's really important for pulling in some of these things. Yes.
I would say that actually what I find more satisfying about this movie compared to some of the other dabbances into multiverses that Marvel are playing with is that actually I do feel a sense of this kind of passing on in the kind of the Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield figures. And I think maybe we can see if we can articulate exactly what's being passed on, but there is definitely a sense of like them giving something, or giving a kind of seal of approval. I think certainly with the kind of the complicated way in which Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man career
Left,
ended.
yeah.
Whether this is a kind of studio sanctioned narrative, but there's a kind of sense that being back in the movie gives Tom Holland a sense that he is now not the usurper Spider-Man, but the rightful
It's like a
Spider-Man.
process of kind of authentication and maybe in the case of the Garfield ones, rehabilitation.
Yeah, giving him the ending that all those like character
and
resolution.
actually, both of them kind of suffered kind of ignominious endings. In
This
that,
is true.
Spider-Man 3 was a absolute. Oh, actually, did
We're
it
all
right
picturing
commercially.
him dancing.
Yeah. And then he was going to do another one, and then it all kind of fell apart like a wet cake. So Andrew Garfield gets kind of dragged in, and I'm sure he didn't get dragged in too harshly. I'm sure a nice contract was
paid
prepared.
handsomely.
But
his
a
drags.
kind of there is that kind of one doesn't hand. Neither of them handed the baton. The studio replaced them.
So not to pull away from this conversation of kind of handing of batons and that sort of thing, but because we're talking about actors, there was something that I wanted to pick up, and I'm curious as to what you guys think, because I've pitched this to a couple of people and it hasn't gone down terribly well.
Okay.
But when I saw the film, and I was particularly struck with Alfred Molina, but with all of the actors, and Jamie Foxx, Willem Dafoe, and then later on we have Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. Less so with the Spider-Men, but with the villains, it occurred to me that Doc Ock, the iconic villain Doc Ock from Spider-Man 2, Sam Raimi's film from 2004, that character is more than the performance of Alfred Molina. The character that many people love from Spider-Man 2, the Sam Raimi film, is a composite, and here's where we kind of move into issues of kind of labor around film production, of Alfred Molina's labor as an actor, but also the costume designer, the VFX artists, the puppets who are working on the arms, the director, the cinematographer, hell, even the caterer, the people driving everyone to set. So that performance is shaped by a particular production context. And then you get a movie like Spider-Man No Way Home, and they're like, hey, get Alfred Molina back in. People love him. And Alfred Molina shows up for a few days on a green screen stage. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with Alfred Molina's performance, and I love Alfred Molina. But I was struck by how it did not feel like the same character, and it made me reflect upon how character is more than just the lone actor doing the job, creating that figure. There's all these other dependencies, and then you put them in a new film 20 years later, and maybe there's different kinds of production technique that are going on, obviously different director, different co-stars, and it just isn't quite the same thing. So it got me thinking about that, especially in relation to Alfred Molina, but also Jamie Foxx. I mean, we all know that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is the best of all the Spider-Man films, don't we? Especially if we've seen it in 3D.
Right.
Jamie Foxx's villain Electro, brilliant. And he is such a non-figure in No Way Home. And partly that's because of the narrative, the script, how much he's given to do. But partly it's just because Jamie Foxx, again, is showing up because someone said, hey, come back and do the Electro thing. Whereas at the time of the 2014 film's production, where he was the main villain, presumably there's going to have been a lot more investment in the crafting of that character and kind of care around how it goes on screen. So tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm talking nonsense.
Throw in the lizard. What's his name?
Reese fans.
Yes.
Was he even there? Because I know Thomas Hayden Church is just reused footage.
Is it right? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, exactly. So that kind of belittling of some of the characters that in their own films have their own time, space, context, culture, community about their creation and things like that. I'm following this. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No.
So your question is sort of does it
is
make
there,
us?
am I right?
Am I right?
The part of the experience of watching Far From Home is to realise that character.
No Way Home.
Yeah.
All the homes.
Part of the experience of watching Spider-Man No Way Home is that it asks you to reflect that character is specific to kind of time, space, culture. Is this a production issue? Is this an
I think it's
issue?
a production issue. I think it's less that the film is asking us to think about this and more that in an era when we have, as we've been talking about, these kinds of transmedia kind of smudgings together, and we are seeing it across all these other brands, we are going to be kind of wrestling with those consequences. That we are going to have to think about who is crafting this character. Is it just the actor, or is it other things too? And also not just performance, I guess, but also other creative roles that are being kind of, maybe the set from the Tim Burton Batman films that's just dropped into the Flash, presumably. But does it feel like that same set, or is it just this kind of blank quotation that then that carries enough of an emotional charge to be memed and to help sell the film, but is not to lean into very, very old theory, but a kind of Jamesonian pastiche, this kind of blank thing that's devoid of substance.
Yeah,
it's this sort of postmodern theory, but I know we're all very far beyond that here.
Okay, and I guess the other, just playing with some of the ideas that raises is that there's also, so Alfred Molina comes back, so the kind of bodily on-screen stardom labor is acknowledged as kind of he's allowed to claim that character almost even more so by coming back, in that they could have just recast Doc Ock and done a different version of him, but there's a sense the film is both asserting Molina's ownership over the character, whilst dissipating the kind of ownership of, well, I don't know who did the VFX in both movies.
Just presuming that nothing else matters. As long as we get Alfred Molina dressed roughly in the same way.
Yes, and ignore the fact that he's obviously aged.
Maybe we de-age him, maybe we don't, but it sort of depends on the direction of because I think... is anyone de-aged in the film?
Yes, and this is...
Why did I think you'd know the answer to that question?
The reason I know the answer to this is because...
I just want to pause very quickly. Chris has been trying to talk about de-aging on this podcast for about 6 months, and every episode I cut it out because right. And yesterday, Chris got the runner-up prize at the BAFTA for his wonderful article on de-aging, and as tribute to that, please talk as much as you'd like about de-aging now.
Do you know? Well, thank you, and not like this, Alex. Not like this. No, I would say. So the reason I know about the de-aging in this is just simply because the nature of academic publishing means that the duration in which this article was in the works, I had to kind of keep track of the latest examples. And often de-aging is this kind of connective tissue between different parts of a franchise. It's often it's within a narrative, so it's chronological in the sense that it's being used to connect sequences from the past to the present, whether it's a very short sequence in one of the Kingsman films to sort of show Harry Hart, played by Colin Firth's previous life. It's used in the film like Central Intelligence with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson to kind of have a pre-credit sequence where he's young and then he sort of turns into The Rock. He turns from Bob Stone kind of into this, Anyway, so it's often used as sort of a marker of chronology, but it's also used as connective tissue with regards to entries in a franchise. So we expect certain actors to sound the same way, but we sort of expect them to look the same way in some senses, and I remember the kind of production, this is getting a bit off tangent, but the production of the second Toy Story, which is 4 years after the first one, and you have all this technology to make Woody look shiny and brand new, but the filmmakers couldn't because that would alienate what Woody looks like so they build in a sequence where Woody gets restored and painted so that they can go, oh, this is what the new technology can do. We can make him shiny. So we expect especially animated characters, to look and sound a certain way, and that's kind of one of the pleasures of the franchises. So in the case of this, there are some digital de-aging effect shots for Defoe and for Molina, just because, as you alluded to earlier, Nick, that there are kind of 20 years really between these two films. So it's really about how these films want to and whether they do claim de-aging as an effect. And obviously de-aging is one of those effects that recurs quite a lot in the Marvel Cinematic Universe anyway, as well as repeated scenes. And in fact, the last Spider-Man movie, Far From Home, repeats a sequence from Captain America Civil War, which is that de-aging sequence featuring Robert Downey Jr. So de-aging is sort of itself homaged in the second span. So yes, so de-aging, there are some de-aging effects in the film to kind of bring things up to date and to not presumably to alienate the audience's thinking, well, that's Molina, and it's like, so almost like the visual effects are allowed to improve, but the de-aging effects are allowed to mask the fact that the actor has got old. Well, so we embrace the new in some cases, but we don't embrace what the character looks like now. So so the corrective possibilities of CGI are in a really interesting kind of, I think both Michelle Pearson and Eilish would talk about the kind of connoisseurship of effects audiences, that you're always judging, you're always sort of in a standoff with the effects. And in fact, watching these films, you can sort of say, yeah, the effects have improved a lot, and that's often one of the ways that we mark up these films, I think. Is part of that. It's obviously, the previous film, as you said, it's about a visual effects artist. So it's essentially about the illusion of effects and the labour of effects, and where credit is given to effects artists and or not given to effects artists and things like this. But also it's about. Is it about the role of genre in that? Because these are also superhero movies doing that. So I just wondered if it's interesting that Spider-Man is doing this, but these are superhero movies that are talking about and obviously Marvel's been in the news with regards to sort of the way that it pays its effects artist or effects artists working right to the bone to order essentially to do these effects, and so it seems like it's interesting whether Marvel are trying to kind of cover their backs in that sense. I don't know. It's just the fact these are Marvel films doing this, are popular Marvel films, and then there are superhero movies that are rupturing in the way that you've described.
And you could argue that that's kind of the return of the repressed or the unconscious. Marvel as a studio is wrestling with these issues professionally, they sort of somehow sneak their way into the text. And just as any conversation around what's the new Spider-Man film going to be in any of these corporate boardrooms, presumably would have involved conversations about, well, let's look at the Tobey Maguire films. Why did they work? Let's look at the Andrew Garfield films. Why did they not work? What do people like? Doc Ock. And then you assemble a film from those conversations, and then the film itself, No Way Home, is visibly assembled in that way. It's so there's the kind of the visibility of the corporate processes behind the management of these kind of enormous superhero genre films. I think is it's oddly present in Spider-Man.
So do you think, because you mentioned earlier on that the multiverse narrative is a kind of alibi for US cinema to be able to do these things, and that reflexivity is built into No Way Home, because as soon as the characters enter, as soon as Jamie Foxx or Willem Dafoe, as soon as the characters enter into the film, they're sort of caged up, almost as if they are locked away, ready to be deployed at various sorts of moments. Is the multiverse enough of an alibi in this film? Because you said that you feel a bit of a disjuncture with regards to Doc Ock, and it doesn't feel like. And is the film trying to? Is the multiverse narrative of the film not saying, look, the characters feel a little bit off themselves because they don't quite understand, and Doc Ock kind of doesn't. You're not my Peter.
Yeah.
So is the multiverse narrative enough of an alibi to gloss over these kinds of fractures, because it's trying to really lean into the chaos and the fracture and the...
It's interesting when we're using the word alibi, that implies it's a crime being committed.
Yeah.
I think that's just that's kind of got, maybe this is just a kind of
excuse,
reductive or boring reading, frankly, but I'll do it anyway, which is just like to
crime.
To draw on kind of traditions of critical theory, right? The power of the capitalist sort of ideology is that it's to acknowledge all its contradictions, its inequalities, its badness, and to convince those operating within it that there's no alternative. And in a way, there's something going on in this kind of Marvel as a studio is sort of claiming all of these old versions. Before the multiverse, there are other Spider-Man and there are other Spider-Men, and we can have a debate over which is the better system, which is the better fictional world, which is my Spider-Man. By the end of the movie, you can pick whichever one you want because it doesn't matter. Yeah. They're all Marvels.
You can have any colour you want as long as it's Spider-Man.
As long as it's Spider-Man, you can have any flavour of soup as long as it's made by Campbell's. It's kind of that. What's it? The illusion of choice, right? So I wonder if it's that's how these things work. They acknowledge their contradictions, and yet the result of that is it makes the ideology porous enough for to include everybody.
So does this mean it's a post Spider-Verse film then? Because of that, because that is the narrative of Spider-Verse. We've had the conversation. Anyone can be Spider-Man. You can be a person of colour, or you can be a pig, and that doesn't reduce the meaning of that at all. But it's just an interesting.
Well, the reading of that we kind of got to, which I think looking back might be a slightly too optimistic one, is that the film kind of therefore celebrates multiplicity and goes, these are all Spider-Man, everyone, that. I don't think this film does that. I think this film allows a space where it's cool to see these three characters all having an end battle to the end.
Yep.
But the rhetoric of the movie is very much by the end. Right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that.
Yeah.
But Tom Holland is Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And please let us get on with that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And that's a very different ending to Multiverse. Although, does Spider-Pig have the same level of legitimacy as Miles's character? I'm not so convinced.
And it's part, we've talked about this, pretty kind of part of all these movies, whether it's the Wreck-It Ralph movies, whether it's these kind of general IP crossovers that are bringing in this. This is in conversation with Space Jam: A New Legacy. It's in conversation with these kinds of movies where they're just chucking everything in. And I'm always interested, and maybe you have an answer to this, about why this is
no pressure.
Why this is happening? Why are multiverse films and these kinds of extravagant IP crossovers so popular at the moment? What was the moment where they suddenly this became the boundaries between the boundaries between different Spider-Man? What led to the fracture?
At what point did Doctor Strange cast the spell?
Yeah, what was the spell in Hollywood that was cast to make this happen?
That's a really good question. And thinking on my feet, I think there's a few different factors which will all disappear from my brain. I suppose. Well, for one thing, you've got Disney buying everything. So an example of different brands, character IPs, franchises, all coming under a single kind of umbrella. And that's not massively unusual, but it seems to be particularly kind of heightened, intensified at the moment. Okay. So if a single overarching studio owns all of these things that they can then blend them together, then now they're seeing a kind of pathway to do that.
Okay.
So I think that's one reason. I think another reason, which I'm going to not do justice, is the internet, social media, memes. I think the contemporary digital culture in which images and snippets and sort of small ideas circulate from these earlier texts then create, would Spider-Man No Way Home have been made if it weren't for the fact that people have been memeing Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man for the last 15 years? I think that's the idea that we can, in our Twitter threads, throw in Andrew Garfield, Tobey Maguire, and all
next
of this stuff next to each other, having a conversation through whatever kind of subtitles we slap on it.
That's interesting. It makes me think of the kind of the scroll. People have talked. I think is it array aesthetics? This sort of kind of the swipe between different. It's almost as like the films themselves are like the scrolling Twitter feed. You're just scrolling between all these different. And you land on different characters and stuff. So
Lisa Peirce and Deborah Tudor have both written really interesting stuff about kind of that. The swiping, the shard, the kind of array, the composite nature, which we can then also kind of pull back to visual effects and the fact that these images are, for the most part, composites of various elements, some of which were shot on set, some of which were developed by this effects company or that effects company, and then it's all glued together.
Years apart,
potentially. And likewise, so just as Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland standing in the same room is this kind of this composite of multiple iterations of the franchise, so too, a visual effects action sequence is a composite of all these different kind of workflows and production realities.
Well, they do talk about memes. They also do the meme, the Spider-Man.
And they do
meme.
the meme.
So they're sort of they're aware. So the snippet stuff. So is it Carol Vanellis's book Unruly Media?
Yes.
Which is sort of like it's this sort of. Chaos is the wrong word, and people have written on chaos cinema and a post-intensified continuity way of thinking about a culture of kind of quick change in the movies where everything is sort of these. I like that idea that the film is sort of this nice pleasurable scroll through, or not pleasure. Well, we can debate whether it's pleasurable or not, but a kind of scroll through the kinds of the way that we engage with social media and the scrolling pattern of seeing all these different memes and little truncated clips and facial expressions, and the film is kind of playing it's speaking to that kind of audience. That sort of. Any other? So that was a couple of reasons.
There was a couple of reasons.
Any other ones?
There was a third, which I've probably
kind of internet,
now.
social media.
I think the only other one I was going to say was to
Disney,
say that this all you need is one successful example, and then it could potentially cascade. So you have those two other reasons, and then you have, I don't know, let's just call it Rick and Morty, which is a hugely popular animated show, which has I'm not to say mainstreamed the idea of the multiverse, but really kind of given it this prominence, and then maybe that's all it takes for a bunch of people to go, that's a solution. That's what we can use to do this work. So it's not like all of these kind of separate entities kind of alight upon the idea because it's the right time. I think it can just be a case of one significant cultural product having a big enough impact that then everything else comes in its wake, and we'll probably, history will read it as Marvel doing it first, but I think there are probably other precursors, and then Marvel's just this enormous example, and then from that we'll have the DC universe doing it, and who knows what else will kind of plug into the multiverse.
Can I throw in some half-baked thoughts on sort of ethics surrounding all of this? And by that I'm not talking sort of the ethics of what we were just talking about, of which I don't have a particularly positive opinion on, but the kind of opportunities within that structure for I guess individual consumers and groups of consumers to have ideas and respond to this kind of stuff. And I really am playing with kind of half-formed thoughts here, but when you were talking about this idea of it kind of being analogous to scrolling through social media, it struck me that, of course, there's this paradox of social media, which is that we're talking about the consumption of social media because of the way it's designed as a bunch of individuals looking at content, when, of course, the very nature of, or one of the things social media could be able to do if it were designed or coded slightly differently is actually it's a fabric of different users. That's what social media is. Suppose it's a web, if you will, a social web that then, thanks to the monetization of social media and coding and things like that, turns a bunch of people in a web back into individuals looking at a meme. So I'm just interested in this kind of weird paradox between all these kind of neoliberal market forces that we're describing, all these individualized modes of consumption that we're describing, and this kind of pull towards films that want to connect everything together, to connect everything together on screen, to ask us to read individual films in response to masses of other films that are out there, to develop reading strategies in which characters can only be fully understood if we fully immerse ourselves in everything they've ever done, and indeed come together to kind of work it all out and share different modes. You know, sometimes you need the person whispering in your ear, that's because of the television show there.
Do you need that?
You know, you need a kind of a whole social infrastructure to understand these movies.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the question I'm raising. You know, there's an interesting paradox going on in that actually these offer quite socialized modes of reading. They are made available. Whether people take them up on it is another question.
Yes.
But they're made available through these structures at the same time as all this stuff that you're describing.
I'll throw in another. Well, that wasn't half baked. I'll throw in a positively uncooked,
delicious,
which people love raw cookies out. People want. I think it's the. Is it interesting that on the back of that it's the superhero genre which is geared to this, given that the superhero genre is about sort of an exceptional individual who has great responsibility.
Yes.
And
very good. No, I'm gonna throw a raw egg back at you of uncookedness.
So all that's left for you, Nick, is the flour.
Fine.
What are we making?
So I feel like that's also something that the Marvel people in the offices would have said. What are we making?
What are we doing?
So I feel like
Money.
in a genre which is about exceptional individuals rather than sort of teamwork, that's not what the superhero is about. It's about great responsibility. This film is about great responsibilities because it's having it's trying to place a character that is known for being a kind of lone figure, let's say, an exceptional lone figure who is given to Earth, or who in the case of Superman, or who becomes the protector of a city like Batman or whatever, or Spider-Man, a sort of accidental hero. These are individual figures, and so it's interesting that individuality is being subsumed by a desire to connect and be connected.
But Spider-Man, this is the raw egg of all the figures to do this with.
We're doing it then.
It's interesting because I think Spider-Man is of all those figures you've just named, Spider-Man is the one whose real world is the most kind of embedded within a structure that many of us will be better able to identify with compared to an alien coming down,
or a millionaire,
a
friendly neighborhood millionaire.
He is the one most invested in forging relationships with other people.
Yeah.
Often as an obstacle to his superheroing, and he also superheroes out of this kind of particular kind of sense of responsibility, in the sense that he just because he has the agency to do it, he therefore must do it at cost to his personal life. And the one positive thing I did feel coming out of this movie, and again, maybe I'd be delighted to hear how wrong I am on this as well, is that I think that was missing from the Holland version of the Spider-Man, who was introduced as this kind of flippant, fun sidekick to Tony Stark in the middle of
Civil War,
yeah. And has really quite enjoyed being a superhero ever since. And Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield enjoyed it a little bit, not much, and certainly not in the second one. Tobey Maguire never really... He whoops about when he has a bit of fun when he's web slinging, but largely...
And when he's dancing.
Largely he does it as a response to trauma, to loss, and to a sense that no one else can, therefore he must. And I liked that kind of... almost the two of them coming back thrusts that character back into those kind of... It's easy to be very glib about the kind of motto of Spider-Man because it is so nonsensically repeated, but that is actually meditated on in the first two incarnations of the character, in the way it never is in this Marvel version, but by the end of it, that character is infused with the same kind of I must, therefore I will, and yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't have an answer to any of these eggs or recipe ideas, but and I haven't seen the
get out the kitchen. Carry on.
I haven't seen the second Venom film, and I really want to. But can we imagine I'm sure we can imagine a Tom Holland Spider-Man film with Venom. But Tom Holland, as you kind of suggested, he's much less tortured.
Yes.
So it would read very differently. This would not be an expression of his internal torment and his guilt about the people he's lost or couldn't save. It would just have to be a bunch of fun japes where he and Tom Hardy have a fight and then they team up to fight something bigger.
Yeah.
Whereas, like in Spider-Man 3, not everybody's favorite film, but Venom is functioning as this expression of pain and anguish, or at least kind of is coming vaguely from that place. Yeah. So I think like that as a thought exercise, how would a character like Venom, who takes over Spider-Man and is the villainous Spider-Man, how would that function with Hollander? Very differently, if at all, I think.
Yeah.
I've called him Hollander. I knew I'd do that at some point.
Yeah.
I really want Tom Hollander to play Spider-Man.
Although the kind of person that he is at the end of the movie, I mean, we'll wait and see, but there's a hint towards a kind of more... I never think you're supposed to identify with Spider-Man in the first... in as a character. I think you're not supposed to go, God, I wish I was Spider-Man. I think to an extent you are in the visuals and in the fun and the frivolity, but actually in terms of the thematic of the movie, it's I'm glad. I think the film. I'm glad there is a Spider-Man. Yeah. I'm glad I'm not Spider-Man.
Well, I'm not going to over-egg this, but we've talked about the difference between alignment, allegiance, and subjectivity. Yeah. So I think you're saying is that one enjoys being kind of aligned with him in the narrative, and maybe I'm pleased that my allegiance is with him, but I don't want to embody his.
I guess the meditation of the movie, the thing it asks you to speculate on is that would you like to be exceptional? Everyone wants to be exceptional. Everyone wants to be powerful. These are kind of primal fantasies of subjectivity. Would you like to be that at the expense of being a subject in the world with others?
But the whole film therefore is about that, because the whole film is about, obviously the culmination is the erasure of memory or the erasure of. But the film begins. One can't identify with him when he's a superhero, but when his superheroic identity is revealed at the end of the previous film,
yes,
he becomes a lot more relatable. Isn't a word for my students listening, so please don't keep using it. There's a whole New York Times article about the word relatable, but he becomes more relatable because I'm actually seeing a character I can now empathise with or sympathise with a character who is now struggling with his identity, or his identity is being exposed, or he's now the subject of something, or and the whole end of the whole film is leading up to the final point where MJ doesn't recognise him, and that's like now he's finally been given a humanity. He's been a superhero for so long. We never really, and because he's rare for a superhero in that we are introduced to his superheroic personality first. That never really happens. You're introduced to the human before the transformation. Whereas Spider-Man, because he entered into the world of Civil War in 2016 as a fully formed thing. The next film has to quickly take it back, but not far, because and then bring it forward again. So Spider-Man is a really interesting character within this MCU, and it is tempting to lump everything in together with the MCU and we talk about phases and sagas, when actually you can extrapolate the important kind of mini sagas that are happening. I think Spider-Man is a good example of that, because the whole film is about we've had the grief in the second one, and this film is like, okay, so I'm now going to lose the person I love, and that feels more relatable than which isn't a word, but more relatable than.
But it's
swinging.
The same but different, because it's like Uncle Ben, but it's not. It's Aunt May. So we're hitting that same beat, as you kind of mentioned earlier, but with enough of a twist. So yeah, it's still a Spider-Man film. She even says,
do you know what? I didn't even register that.
She doesn't say with great power comes great responsibility, but she says a version of that line, and we as viewers are supposed to go like, nah, see what you're doing.
Do you know what? I hadn't registered that her death was I couldn't remember.
She's Uncle Ben.
Yeah, okay. I don't know.
Death has to happen to make Spider-Man be Spider-Man. Yeah. That's what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man.
But we've already had 2.5.
Well, no,
we've had 5 films
as a
with
noble figure of virtue.
Yeah.
That's what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man.
Yes.
He's a dick in the movies. In the first, he gets
Homecoming.
the powers and he uses them. Well, yeah, I would argue he's a dick in Homecoming, but that's not quite what I meant. But in the kind of mythology of the film,
right,
he gets the powers and isn't a hero. He just uses it to, like, what does he do in the first
climb
movie?
The walls and climb a building
and earn some money from wrestling and those kind of things. It's the death the death of another of someone close to him that reveals that this is not. That there's only one way to do this, even if you don't want to do it.
So therefore, it comes quite late on in this iteration of Spider-Man, because he's been in Civil War, he's had 2.5 films on his own, he's been in a couple of Avengers movies, and now he's given that scene.
Yes.
So it's really. So what can the film do with the last hour and a bit after that scene? Because it comes quite late on in his own mythology. And it's the prompt. I can't remember exactly when it comes, actually. But has he met the? No, he hasn't met the.
His friends are trying to find him following Aunt May's death when they accidentally
open these portals.
Quite absurdly, and I think narratively quite lazily.
Yes.
Open a couple of portals and suck in 2 other Spider-Men by accident.
We've had a whole film of Doctor Strange learning the ways of that, and Ned's like, yeah, just give me a minute.
Ned's magic.
Ned's just do that.
Magic Ned.
So that's interesting that pivot point that comes in some of these earlier Spider-Man movies, often within the first act, let's say maybe the second act.
Got to get things moving.
Yeah, got to get in this. It's the reverse of that, because it takes a long time. He's Spider-Man for a long time before he has this moment.
Well, we could argue Spider-Man for 3 movies before this.
Longer.
Yeah.
He's been Spider-Man for 5 years.
Oh yeah, if you throw all the Avengers
this is what I mean.
and,
He's been and the cameos, and so that's an interesting sort of way of doing that scene.
like that is an interesting pivot point to then bring in the other Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Because there's something about at that moment of intense grief and that kind of confrontational moment where you have to decide who you are in the face of that challenge. That's when we suddenly get this sort of splintered identity. This like, okay, here's all these different versions of me that I now need to kind of pick from or pick and choose from in order to, again, we're back to kind of trauma and grief and therapy, but like, how do I step forward after this horrible thing, Aunt May's death? And that's the moment where we get multiple selves. And I think that, but I don't think that's something that the film is doing consciously or that it kind of is really terribly interested in, but it is.
But yes, to use a phrase I reckon Victor Perkins liked to use, it's like it makes available or invites.
Yeah, it invites rather than. We haven't really. We won't have time. Sorry, is there anything?
No, I just realised that I've attributed the late great Victor Perkins as somehow legitimising my argument, which I'm convinced I would if I was so lucky. But yes, but I think that distinction's interesting.
So we probably don't have time to go into the Venom stuff, but it's interesting that Tom Holland appears in the second. Spoiler alert! So appears in the credits of the second Venom, Let There Be Carnage, because Eddie Brock, played by Tom Hardy, is transported as a result of this fracture that's happened into the world of Tom Holland as Spider-Man, and then returns in the credits of this film, No Way Home, back to his world while leaving a bit of Venom, the symbiote, there. So.
We shall see.
That's the next saga.
What a strange world we live in.
What a strange world. So there's that.
Do we have any other frames
effects,
of reference we want to throw at this?
J.K. Simmons, he's not in this one, but is he in this one?
He is in this one.
Is he?
Yeah.
Not for very long. He's never in it enough, I find.
That's probably true.
But he's another element. He's another a thing you need to throw in because...
Why not?
Why not? He's available.
Everything is a symbiote that's just left. Left.
J.K. Simmons as Venom. There we go. Basically just Whiplash again.
So yeah.
Okay. So any other final thoughts? We lots of thoughts there. So we don't need.
That's a nice way of saying nothing was coherent.
Nothing was coherent, but that's the movie.
Haven't we talked about imagination? You said teased at the start around kind of imagination, and I suppose that's another thing that the multiverse it allows audiences to. I don't say imagine, but reimagine, or I don't know. It's just a really interesting thing that Hollywood's done over the last 10 years, let's say.
No, we haven't used the words, but I think I think the phrase you used at the beginning, that was the fantasy space of contemporary. I like that phrase, and I think what we've tried to articulate is some of the ways in which the fantasy space is either used by its production, by the sort of wider structures of political economics, and indeed the kind of what's made available, to use the phrase again, to those watching it, enjoying it, consuming it, kind of that sort of thing. So I don't have any more to say on that, other than I think this is all about the way in which these films encourage us to imagine these various possibilities.
Yeah. Great.
Nick, you alluded at the beginning that this is from a project that will be out soon or out right now, depending on when I end up releasing this podcast.
Yeah, so tease us.
Tell us about it, because it might be freely available for people to access right now.
I don't know, freely.
Yes, all right. It's very costly available, but it's still very interesting, so let's talk about it.
So Spider-Man is kind of a mascot for a book called Gooey Media that is out with Edinburgh this year, 2023, which is all about the graphic user interface. So GUI, GUI, often referred to as a GUI. So it's all about how we receive so much of our media, and indeed produce so much of our media, using screens, using graphic user interface screens and the programs that they allow us to access. And it seeks to map the consequences of that. And a lot of that is about transmedia aesthetics. So Spider-Man, as a character, obviously coming from comic books, existing in films, games, television shows, and as I sort of mentioned earlier, as a web slinger, he swings effortlessly between these media, which all increasingly, especially the films, the games, come to resemble one another, and more than that, come to resemble, as we've sort of talked about, the graphic user interface and the programs on it. So in order to understand a film like No Way Home, we need to kind of delve into the VFX processes that designed its spectacle, but we also need to think about social media feeds and how they might be kind of contributing to its organization of narrative logic, and also the kind of aesthetics of maybe the action sequences being drawn from Spider-Man video games, which are also very popular at the moment. So Spider-Man is a kind of useful way into the contemporary screen media environment, which I argue is this kind of sticky web, and because we're watching so much of things on one screen. Previously it would be like, we'll go to the cinema to watch some cinema, we'll watch some TV on our cathode ray television at home, but now the same tablet, phone, computer screens our films, our TV shows, our games, our social media, our maps, our email. And so all of these things start to kind of blend, blur, stick, glue together. And so that's what the book's about.
Great.
And, yeah.
Brilliant.
Sounds really interesting.
Another must read.
So it's Gooey, GUI.
The book is Gooey, GOOEY.
Gooey is in slime.
Ectoplasm.
Media.
Exactly.
A symbiote, if you will.
Exactly. Venom doesn't come up in the book, which is a missed opportunity, but there are lots of other puns and kind of references to goo,
I'd expect nothing
stickiness.
less.
Well, it's out now or about to be out, so get it pre-ordered, get it purchased, get your librarian to buy it, colleagues.
Yes, please.
Get it on those reading lists. Sounds really, really interesting. I'm looking forward to reading it myself.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for coming on. These spaces, your work is always very good at finding these kind of digital spaces that people like me
that
who
extend
don't
out
really,
or
well,
that go this way.
Sure, let's use the metaphor a bit longer, but in all seriousness, it's it's always nice to talk more about these things and learn more about this kind of the richness of digital culture and its murky
underbellies
and fascinating underbellies. So
Thanks, Alec. Appreciate it.
And thanks for coming on the show. We have to do admin, don't I?
Yeah.
Yes. So, fantasy-animation.org, it's the website. It has our whole archive of blog posts and podcasts. Forgot what the word was, and a podcast as well. Yeah. We've done loads of stuff.
I wrote a review of I think it was Far From Home. And I'd forgotten I'd written that. But
then you talk about VFX and probably. It sounds like you.
A picture of painting Matisse with some glasses.
Sounds good.
We've done Marvel.
We've done a few of the
regular
Marvels.
intervals, and we've also done Multiverse of Madness, which would perhaps be a nice kind of partner to this episode, perhaps.
Yeah. And if there are any concepts or ideas that we touched on in the episode that needs a bit more unpacking, you know how to do that. You can email us at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com for suggestions for future Footnote episodes. You can also use the same handle to find us on all the various social media platforms and talk to us there. But until the next instalment of the Fantasy Animation franchise, we'll see you next time.
I'll see you in the credits of Venom 3. Bye.